brief overview of Time and Free Will by Henri Bergson, published 1889. The principal ideas are that it is inappropriate to limit thought to spatial concepts. Time, in particular, should not be conceived of as extension. It is misleading to conceive of dynamic matters by the use of static concepts. In giving accounts of aesthetic feelings or sensations, philosophers often attempt to describe qualitative changes in a quantitative fashion. Space is the material with which mind builds up the conception of number, but the sensations by means of which we form the idea of space are themselves unextended and qualitative, not quantitative. Time is duration, and duration may very well be nothing but a succession of qualitative changes, permeating each other. A self of pure duration is not subject to the distinctions which are imposed upon the self, considered symbolically. The self is free when its acts spring from the whole personality. Bergson stands as one of the great names in the 19th and early 20th century philosophy, and the question of the freedom of the will is one of philosophy's classical problems. However, it is interesting to note that Bergson's little book is one of the few which treat this problem directly. Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine give classical analyses of time, but these come about in the course of the development of larger works. The problems which surround freedom of the will are numerous, but few have attacked the problem directly. In fact, it is probably safe to say that the focus upon freedom of the will as a central issue is a development of modern philosophy. Theology developed this as a major part of the question of God's foreordination. Classical philosophy dealt with freedom only incidentally. Modern philosophy singled it out as a major issue, and Bergson wrote one of the few direct and systematic treatments of the issue. The approach in this work is through psychology, and particularly through an analysis of psychic states. Not only had philosophy not yet been separated in Bergson's time from psychology as a discipline, but the interest in psychology had really only begun to grow within philosophy. The empirical psychology and the interest in sense perception, so typical of British empiricism, combined with continental phenomenology to bring psychology to the foreground in philosophy, and this is Bergson's approach. As a Frenchman, the introspective analysis of Descartes has left its mark, although Bergson is noted as the great opponent of the strict Cartesian rationalism. The author is adept at detecting approaches which are inadequate to their subject matter, and so here he starts out by noting the inappropriateness of always thinking in spatial concepts. His problem, free will, is common to both metaphysics and psychology, and he begins by trying to point out a confusion of duration with extension, which has complemented the treatment of the problem of free will. The first of the 3 chapters discusses the intensity of psychic states. In considering intensity in relation to extension, Bergson finds that intensity contains the image of something virtually extended. As is so often the case with Bergson, he breaks down barriers and finds it in 2 apparently different phenomena, elements of similarity and aspects of community. Again, Bergson considers the reflective consciousness as a way of looking at things and finds that it is repelled by the wholly dynamic way of perceiving. Such static dynamic oppositions are Bergson's prime target, and he makes the case for dynamic views without surrendering more traditional approaches. As an example of gradual transition, which results in change in kind, Bergson cites aesthetic feelings as a striking example of the progressive intrusion of new elements, which in reality are merely altered emotions and not an increase in magnitude as they appear to be. In an aesthetic feeling, we sympathize with the feeling that is expressed. Art aims at impressing feelings on us rather than at expressing them. The feeling of the beautiful is no specific feeling, but every feeling experienced by us assumes an aesthetic character, if it has been suggested and not caused. Bergson continues with his analysis of sensations, emotions, and muscular effort after finishing his discussion of feeling. The magnitude of a representative sensation, he concludes, depends upon our transferring the cause into the effect. The intensity of the affective element depends, on the other hand, on the more or less important reactions which prolong the external stimulations and find their way into the sensation itself. We promote the change of quality into variations of magnitude. Bergson opposes some postulates of what he calls a psychophysical interpretation on the grounds that they cannot be verified unless the postulates are first granted. He resists the reduction of all psychological phenomena to physical states, and he insists that there is no point of contact between the unextended and the extended, between quality and quantity. There is no radical opposition. Both arise as resultant variations in degree and are not disparate in nature. Conscious states should not be considered in isolation from one another. Their proper context is in concrete multiplicity, for they unfold themselves in pure duration. Then you have to go on to inquire what the multiplicity of our inner states becomes, what form duration assumes, when space in which it unfolds is eliminated. The usual radical opposition has been broken down by Bergson, and now the problem becomes one of giving the adequate account of duration as the source. In the second long chapter, Bergson studies duration and begins by breaking down the concept of number into a synthesis of the one and the many. The idea of number implies the simple intention of a multiplicity of parts or units which are absolutely alike. Every clear idea of number implies a visual image in space. For counting material objects means thinking of these objects as being together, thereby leaving them in space. Space is accordingly the material with which the mind builds up number, the medium in which the mind places objects. Ultimately, Bergson finds two kinds of multiplicity, that of material objects to which the conception of number may be applied, and the multiplicity of states of consciousness. The latter cannot be thought of as numerical without the help of some symbolic representation, and in this, a necessary element is space. But now we ask, has duration anything to do with space? It could be that space comes in as a later addition. The sensations by means of which we form the notion of space are themselves unextended and simply qualitative. This is the most likely hypothesis. In actuality, space is what enables us to distinguish a number of identical and simultaneous sensations from one another. It is a principle of differentiation, but not a qualitative one. Consequently, it is a reality with no quality. The mind perceives under the form of extensive homogeneity what is given it as qualitative homogeneity. There are two kinds of reality, one heterogeneous, that of sensible qualities, the other homogeneous, space. Because the latter is clearly conceived by the human intellect, we are able to use clear-cut distinctions to count, to abstract, and also to speak. However, we still regard time as an unbounded medium, different from space, but like it, homogeneous. We can thus conceive of succession without distinction, and think of it as a mutual penetration, as interconnection and organization of elements. Each one represents the whole and cannot be distinguished or isolated from it except by abstract thought. Pure duration might well be nothing but a succession of qualitative changes, which melt into and permeate one another without precise outline. Yet it is extraordinarily difficult to think of duration in its purity. The real concrete self is made of such pure duration, its symbolic substitute has all the artificial distinctions and thus contradictions implied in the problems of freedom, causality and personality. An inner life, it is true, with well distinguished moments and with clearly characterized states, will answer better the requirements of social life. But the self of pure duration overcomes problems of freedom and causation by not being subject to their distinctions. Dynamism is what Bergson prefers, and this starts from the idea of voluntary activity given by consciousness. Mechanism takes the opposite path. The self experiences the first feeling and, according to the dynamic theory, has already changed to a slight extent when the second feeling takes its place. In this way, a dynamic series of states is formed which permeates and strengthens the feeling states which are its members. Freedom depends on such a series. We are free, Bergson says, when our acts spring from our whole personality. Our acts express our personality. They have that indefinable resemblance to it which one sometimes finds to exist between an artist and his work. The believer in free will assumes that the same series of antecedents could issue in several different acts, all equally possible. For Bergson, freedom must be sought in a certain shade or quality of the action itself, and not in the relation of this act to what it is not, or to what it might have been. There are two ways of assimilating antecedent events, the one dynamic and the other static. Yet we still cannot analyze the outcome of a free action, for we cannot know the value of the antecedents without knowing the final act, which is the very thing that is not yet known. The question is whether the definite regularity of antecedent to consequent is found in the domain of consciousness too. That is the whole problem of free will. Of course, if we stand by experience, then we would say that we feel ourselves free, that we perceive force, rightly or wrongly, as a free spontaneity. The relation of inner causality is purely dynamic and has no analogy with the relation of two external phenomena which actually condition each other. Freedom, relation of the concrete self to the acts which it performs. This relation is indefinable just because we are free. Every demand for an explanation of freedom comes back to the question, can time be adequately represented by space? If you are dealing with time flow, then the answer is yes. Freedom is therefore a fact. Among the facts which we observe, there is none which is clearer. Bergson thus used his famous doctrine of conscious time as flowing from a primitive apprehension of undivided duration. By his doctrine he attempted to release causal action from the grip of mechanical regulation and to place the source of free acts in a consciousness ultimately free from space and its rigid divisions. In Time and Free Will, Bergson thus argues for an undivided duration behind conscious states and normal distinctions, and thereby leaves an area for spontaneity and free decision in psychic states, if not in physical matter.